Hello, this is Shmuel Moshe, and you are listening to the Weekly Parashahcast, the weekly Torah portion podcast where I read the weekly Torah portion and then provide my own interpretation of what I think it all means. This week's weekly Torah portion is Metzora, chapter 14 of Leviticus, and it translates roughly to leprosy or leper in the modern day, but it's not quite an accurate translation. It's referring to an ailment that is more spiritual in nature, but leper is the colloquialism we have in modern English. In any case, we're going to go ahead and get started. For those who want to follow along in English, you can do so on Chabad.org. And remember, everyone, I am not a professional Torah scholar, just somebody who wanted to study the Torah. With that being said, let's go ahead and jump right on into the first portion, Leviticus chapter 14, Parashat Metzora, for its Shabbat falling on the 12th of Nissan, 5784, April 20th, 2024. Verse 1. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, This shall be the law of the person afflicted with Tzarath. On this day of his cleansing he shall be brought to the Kohen. The Kohen shall go outside the camp, and the Kohen shall look, and behold, the lesion of Tzarath has healed in the afflicted person. Then the Kohen shall order, and the person to be cleansed shall take 2 live clean birds, a cedar stick, a strip of crimson wool, and hyssop. The Kohen shall order, and one shall slaughter the one bird into an earthenware vessel over spring water. As for the live bird, he shall take it, and then the cedar stick, the strip of crimson wool, and the hyssop along with the live bird, he shall dip them into the blood of the slaughtered bird over the spring water. He shall then sprinkle 7 times upon the person being cleansed from the Tzarath, and he shall cleanse him. He shall then send away the live bird into the open field. The person being cleansed shall then immerse his garments, shave off all his hair, and immerse himself in water, and become clean. After this he may enter the camp, but he shall remain outside his tent for 7 days. And it shall be on the 7th day that he shall shave off all his hair, that of his head, his beard, his eyebrows, indeed all his hair, he shall shave off. He shall then immerse his garments, and immerse his flesh in water, becoming clean. And on the 8th day he shall take 2 unblemished male lambs, 1 unblemished ewe lamb in its first year, 3/10 of an ephah of fine flour mixed with olive oil as a meal offering, and 1 log of olive oil. And the Kohen who is performing the cleansing shall place the person being cleansed together with these things before the Lord at the entrance of the tent of meeting. And the Kohen shall take 1 male lamb and bring it as a guilt offering, along with the log of oil, and wave them as a waving before the Lord. That's the first portion, so here we have a little bit more elaboration with what happens to a person who does have the leprosy as it's called today, but really Tzarath, totally different affliction that is similar looking to leprosy, but is spiritual in nature. That person gets removed from the camp. The Kohen will then basically give the procedure over them on how to be cleansed. Once the Tzarath has been healed, the process as described here with the 2 birds, the one takes the blood, one gets slaughtered, the other one gets dipped in that with the other items and then gets set free, sprinkling the 7 times upon the person who's been cleansed, and he'll be cleansed. Then he has to shave off all his hair, immerse himself in water, immerse his garments, stay out of his home for a while. I mean, it's very, very intricate, but at the end of it all, he's going to then make 1 proper sacrifice at the end, which will then be the final cleansing portion of his process. So a lot to say there. I do think it's very interesting that there are certain offerings are consistent across the different things like guilt offering, sin offering, and so on. And Tzarath itself is it tends to be associated with a particular action. Lashon hara, the evil tongue, in the case of Miriam, Moses' sister, right? So it's the idea of gossiping among your people. That typically seems to be the source of when people are afflicted with Tzarath, though it can come in other ways. I think that is the main one that it's associated with. In any case, we're going to go ahead and move on to the second portion, chapter 14, verse 13. He shall slaughter the lamb in the place where one slaughters the sin offering and the burnt offering in a holy place. For regarding the Kohen's service, the guilt offering is like the sin offering. It is a holy of holies. The Kohen shall take some of the blood of the guilt offering, and the Kohen shall place it above the cartilage of the right ear of the person being cleansed, on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot. And the Kohen shall take some of the log of oil, and pour it onto the Kohen's left palm. The Kohen shall dip his right index finger into some of the oil that is on his left palm, and sprinkle some of the oil with his index finger 7 times before the Lord. And some of the remainder of the oil that is in his palm, the Kohen shall, on the cartilage of the right ear of the person being cleansed, on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot, on top of the blood of the guilt offering. And what is left over from the oil that is in the Kohen's palm, he shall place upon the head of the person being cleansed, and the Kohen shall effect atonement for him before the Lord. The Kohen shall then perform the service of the sin offering and effect atonement for the person being cleansed of his uncleanness. After this, he shall slaughter the burnt offering. And the Kohen shall bring up the burnt offering and the meal offering to the altar. The Kohen shall thus effect atonement for him, and he shall be completely clean. So here we have the entire process of the actual purification, the cleansing ceremony that takes place at the holy location with the Kohen performing this ceremony. And, it's interesting, like, this is their job. This is their full-time job, So imagine all the people throughout the people of Israel that have this affliction. They each happen to need be assigned a Kohen to go check on them, right? They can't just have one. There's going to be a lot of people who probably suffer from this. So this entire process is very arduous. The Kohen is more or less paid for by the circumstances of the offering and so on. So you'll end up with things like, okay, yeah, there's this much that gets burnt and so on. Paying attention to previous passages about what portion of a sacrifice and an offering goes to the holy men. That's worth keeping in mind as well. But the thing about Tzarath, which we'll talk more about as we go, is that it is something that is afflicted, again, spiritually by God, not something that's like a natural illness. On to the third portion, chapter 14, verse 21. But if he is poor and cannot afford these sacrifices, he shall take 1 male lamb as a guilt offering for a waving to effect atonement for him, and 1/10 of an ephah of fine flour mixed with oil as a meal offering and a log of oil, and 2 turtle doves, or 2 young doves, according to what he can afford. 1 shall be a sin offering, and 1 a burnt offering. And he shall bring them on the 8th day of his cleansing to the Kohen, to the entrance of the tent of meeting before the Lord. And the Kohen shall take the guilt offering lamb, and the log of oil, and the Kohen shall wave them as a waving before the Lord. And he shall slaughter the guilt offering lamb, and the Kohen shall take some of the blood of the guilt offerings, and place it on the cartilage of the right ear, of the person being cleansed, on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot. And the Kohen shall then pour some of the oil into the left palm of the Kohen. And the Kohen shall sprinkle with his right index finger some of the oil that is in his left palm 7 times before the Lord. And the Kohen shall place some of the oil that is in his palm on the cartilage of the right ear of the person being cleansed, on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot, on the place of the blood of the guilt offering. And what is left over from the oil that is in the Kohen's palm, he shall place upon the head of the person being cleansed, to effect atonement for him before the Lord. He shall then perform the service of 1 of the turtle doves or of the young doves, from whatever he can afford. From what he can afford, 1 is a sin offering and 1 is a burnt offering, besides the meal offering, and the Kohen shall effect atonement for the person being cleansed before the Lord. This is the law of one in whom there is a lesion of Tzarath, who cannot afford the full array of sacrifices when he is to be cleansed. So, a couple things. First off, this whole section is about the people who are not financially stable enough to get the full sacrifice offering. So this is an option for them. And this is something that we see recurring because there were also mentions of those who couldn't afford a full sacrifice offering being able to use the less expensive options. So this is something that basically means broadly this is accessible to any person living among the people of Israel to be able to make at least this kind of a sacrifice, which is very important, right? So we don't want to impoverish somebody because they're following protocol. So how do we resolve that? There's a different ruling for those who have less money. Interestingly, on both of these sections, it also talks about the blood on the ear, the hand, and the foot. Now remember, when the Kohen were being anointed, that also was a part of the process. So there's something very special about the right ear, the right thumb or hand, and the right toe, right big toe. What is the significance of those? Well, I can't speak too much about the right ear, though there is a notion of when a slave is kept forever, his ear is pierced by the doorpost. So that's one thing to consider, the relationship of the ear. The hand, being the right hand, is typically the dominant hand, and the right foot the dominant foot. then it would be the big toe, right, that touches things first when you act. So that's my understanding, my interpretation of why it's those parts of the body. Either way, the reality is it was designed spiritually to be affordable and accessible to even those who don't have a lot of money. So it's very important because, again, like a person who commits a sin or is being cleansed of Tzarath, right? It's a lot harder on somebody who's got no money versus somebody who's rich if he could just afford to purchase any animal he wants or provide infinite animals if he had to. Such is the difference between a wealthy and an impoverished person. So there you have it. On to the fourth portion. Chapter 14, verse 33. And the Lord spoke to Moses and to Aaron, saying, When you come to the land of Canaan, which I am giving to you as a possession, and I place a legion of Tzarath upon a house in the land of your possession, and the one to whom the house belongs comes and tells the Kohen, saying, Something like a legion has appeared to me in the house. The Kohen shall order that they clear out the house before the Kohen comes to look at the legion, so that everyone in the house should not become unclean. After this the Kohen shall come to look at the house, and he shall look at the legion. Now if the legion in the walls of the house consists of dark green or dark red sunken-looking stains, appearing as if deeper than the wall, then the Kohen shall go out of the house to the entrance of the house, and he shall quarantine the house for 7 days. Then the Kohen shall return on the 7th day, and look at the house. Now if the legion has spread in the walls of the house, the Kohen shall order that they remove the stones upon which the legion is found, and they shall cast them away outside the city to an unclean place. And he shall scrape out the house from the inside all around, and they shall pour out the mortar dust from what they scraped outside the city into an unclean place. And they shall take other stones and bring them instead of these stones, and he shall take the other mortar dust and plaster the house. And if the legion returns and erupts into the house, after he had removed the stones, and after the house had been scraped around, and after it had been plastered, then the Kohen shall come and look at it. Now if the legion in the house has spread, it is malignant Tzarath in the house, it is unclean. He shall demolish the house, its stones, its wood, and all the mortar dust of the house, and he shall take them outside the city to an unclean place. And anyone entering the house during all the days of its quarantine shall become unclean until the evening. And whoever lies down in the house shall immerse his garments, and whoever eats in the house shall immerse his garments. But if the Kohen comes again, and looks at the legion, and behold, the legion did not spread in the house, after the house had been plastered, the Kohen shall pronounce the house clean, because the legion has healed. To ritually cleanse the house, he shall take 2 birds, a cedar stick, a strip of crimson wool, and hyssop. He shall slaughter 1 bird in an earthenware vessel, over spring water. And he shall take the cedar stick, the hyssop, the strip of crimson wool, and the live bird, and he shall dip them into the blood of the slaughtered bird, and into the spring water, and sprinkle toward the house 7 times. And he shall thus cleanse the house with the blood of the bird, the spring water, the live bird, the cedar wood, the hyssop, and the strip of crimson wool. He shall then send away the live bird outside the city, onto the open field. He shall thus effect atonement for the house, and it will be clean. So here we have an interesting statement. This entire section is about a house that gets afflicted with Tzarath. So this is not a human-exclusive illness, right? This is not something that only can happen to the living flesh. It can happen to a structure as well. And it's also very important here. The English says, and I place a legion of Tzarath upon a house. So in other words, this is God acknowledging that Tzarath is something that is God-given. It is not something that just happens. It's something that is explicitly put there by God. So now we know that Tzarath definitively is a curse or an affliction to mark something. So God can basically give it an indication of, hey, you need to take care of that. So when it happens to the building, the person living in the home will go and get the Kohen and say, Kohen, I need some help. There's something weird going on in my house. It looks awfully spooky, like Tzarath. And then the Kohen will go and he'll look at it, and behold, if it fits the description, it does need to be quarantined and observed. Everybody has to get out just in case. They don't want to get infected with the uncleanliness. Then they come back 7 days later. The Kohen comes back, looks at it and decides, okay, well, look here. It didn't spread, so it seems to be that this isn't so bad, but it was healed, right? Or it did spread. If it does spread, then he has to go in, remove the chunk of the house that has this Tzarath, and then also remake the part that got removed and go through that whole process, and then observe it again and see if it continues, right? So if it's benign and removed, or if it's actually malignant, right? So in other words, it's persistent Tzarath. The house itself cannot be salvaged. It has to be destroyed. and that's just the nature of it. So, it's very important, right? Because again, this is something that is assigned by God, and it makes the people who dwell within it unclean. And so one might ask themselves, well, why would God do that? What is the reason for that? Maybe there's something going on in that home that is simply not appropriate, right? It demands that the home be designated unclean based on the deeds of the people. And I think it's interesting because in doing so, the people who live there will, of course, first off, they're going to be designated as unclean, but they're not going to be embarrassed and exposed as to why they were unclean, right? We're just going to know, oh, my house had an affliction, and, so this is a chance for them to be spurred into action on both atonement for their behaviors and to recognize that, hey, you're not going to get away with it. Someone's watching, and now the Kohens are involved, so you better be on your best behavior. So I think that's the significance there, just literal divine intervention. And when it comes to the sacrifice, you'll notice the similar situation with this one. You'll see the same pieces, right? The birds, the live bird, and the bird that's sacrificed, and all that process. So Tzarath seems to have a very clear treatment plan, regardless if it's for a person, for a garment, or for a building. On to the fifth portion, chapter 14, verse 54. All this is the law for every legion of Tzarath, and for a netek, and for Tzarath of garments and houses, and for a seet, for a sepachat, and for a baharet, to render decisions regarding the day of uncleanness and the day of cleanness. This is the law of Tzarath. Chapter 15. And the Lord spoke to Moses and to Aaron, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, and say to them, If any man has a discharge from his flesh, his discharge is unclean. And this shall be the nature of his uncleanness due to his discharge. If his flesh runs with his discharge, or if his flesh is plugged up by his discharge, that is his uncleanness. Any bedding upon which the man with discharge will lie shall become unclean, and any object upon which he will sit shall become unclean. And a man who touches his bedding shall immerse his garments, and immerse himself in water, and he shall remain unclean until evening. And anyone who sits on an object upon which the man with the discharge will sit shall immerse his garments, and immerse himself in water, and he shall remain unclean until evening. And anyone who touches the flesh of the man with a discharge shall immerse his garments, and immerse himself in water, and he shall remain unclean until evening. And if the man with the discharge spits upon a clean person, that person shall immerse his garments, and immerse himself in water, and he shall remain unclean until evening. Any riding gear upon which the man with the discharge will ride becomes unclean. And whoever touches anything that will be under him becomes unclean until evening. And whoever lifts them up shall immerse his garments, and immerse himself in water, and he shall remain unclean until evening. And whomever the man with the discharge touches, without the latter having rinsed his hands, he shall immerse his garments, and immerse himself in the waters, and he shall remain unclean until evening. And an earthenware vessel with which the man with the discharge will touch shall be broken, and any wooden vessel shall be rinsed in water. When the man with the discharge is cleansed of his discharge, he shall count 7 days for himself for his purification, and then immerse his garments, and immerse his flesh in spring water, and he shall be clean. And on the 8th day he shall take for himself 2 turtle doves or young doves, and come before the Lord to the entrance of the tent of meeting, and give them to the Kohen. And the Kohen shall make them one into a sin offering, and one into a burnt offering. And the Kohen shall effect atonement for him from his discharge from the Lord. Okay, so here we have this entire section about a person. Well, first, the end of the 14th chapter, breaking down the conditions around Tzarath and so on. But then we get into the 15th chapter, and it's about a person who suffers from a discharge, right? So what is a discharge? Well, I think we can just think of this as, think of a person who has a wound, a festering wound, or something wrong with their body, where their body is leaking something, right? So they have like some kind of an ooze or some kind of if you've ever had a pimple, which I'm sure most people have, right? You could consider that when a pimple breaks, there's a discharge. Or if you've ever seen some really unpleasant infections or things like that, there's ooze and so on. So those kinds of things would easily be considered a discharge. And I think the real significance of these commandments around the discharge treatment is cleanliness. And I don't mean just spiritual cleanliness, but I mean actual physical cleanliness. So when we look at the Middle Ages, right, and we look at the bubonic plague, the Dark Ages, what caused the bubonic plague? The answer is a lack of cleanliness was ultimately the biggest reason that people got sick. It was dirty. It was a very dirty life. And people were often blaming the Hebrews because they themselves were not getting sick like everybody else was. So they thought, oh, the Jews must be behind it. But if you look at something like this, I mean, this is very, very particular. Almost to a neurotic degree, it would seem, right? If there's something coming out of the person's body and it's kind of getting everywhere, if you even come into contact with that person, you are now infected, right? You are now unclean. You got to go wash yourself and wash. So you got to disinfect, basically. So while this may seem extreme in some respects, no, this is actually quite sanitary. And again, by following these commandments in particular, I think you'll be very safe. You'll be much less likely to contract illnesses from anything like that, especially from any kind of sickly bodily fluid. So when he's healed, there is a process to also purify. And again, it could be that the illness is God-given, but this is the solution and how we stay clean. Now on to the sixth portion. A man from whom there is a discharge of semen shall immerse all his flesh in water, and he shall remain unclean until evening. And any garment or any leather object which has semen on it shall be immersed in water, and shall remain unclean until evening. A woman with whom a man cohabits, whereby there was a discharge of semen, they shall immerse in water, and they shall remain unclean until evening. If a woman has a discharge, her flesh is discharging blood, she shall remain in her state of menstrual separation for 7 days, and whoever touches her shall become unclean until evening. And whatever she lies on during her menstrual separation shall become unclean, and whatever she sits on shall become unclean. And anyone who touches her bedding shall immerse his garments and immerse himself in water, and he shall remain unclean until evening. And anyone who touches any object upon which she will sit shall immerse his garments and immerse himself in water, and he shall remain unclean until evening. And if he is on the bedding or on the object upon which she is sitting, when he touches it, he becomes unclean until evening. If a man cohabits with her, the uncleanness of her menstruation shall be upon him, and he shall be unclean for 7 days, and any bedding he lies upon shall become unclean. And a woman whose flow of blood flows for many days outside of the time of her menstrual separation, or she has a discharge after her menstrual separation, then all the days she has her unclean discharge she shall be unclean, just like the days of her menstrual separation. Any bedding upon which she lies during all the time of her discharge will have the same uncleanness for her as the bedding of her menstruation. And any object upon which she will sit shall become unclean, like her menstrual uncleanness. And anyone who touches them shall become unclean. He shall immerse his garments and immerse himself in water, and he shall remain unclean until evening. And if she becomes clean of her discharge, she shall count for herself 7 days, and after this she may be cleansed. Thus concludes the sixth portion, and I think that gives us a little bit of context here. So the previous portion was about discharge describing other things, whereas this one now goes into the very specific subject of semen, right? So it's sexual, this portion, and that's a very different matter, right? So it's a different kind of discharge, and it has its own designation about cleanliness, specifically garments, leather objects, etc. It has to be immersed in water. It will be unclean until evening, so that's worth considering. Same thing, any woman who comes into contact with a guy who's got this going on, it also makes her unclean until evening, and she also will need to, immerse herself just to be cleansed. And then it goes in the other direction as well. When a woman is going through her menstrual cycle, there's a 7-day period for this. I guess it's literally called period, right? But it's 7 days, right? So once she starts, the idea is that she's supposed to separate for 7 days. In that time, anything that she comes into contact with will be designated as unclean and does need to be cleansed. So it's better to just stay not in contact to avoid it, because otherwise, once you do so, you lose your spiritual cleanliness for that day. What is the significance of this? What's the big deal? Well, we have to remember when they were going and getting in contact with God, right, for the commandments to be delivered. If I recall correctly, Moses was also commanded or added the command to tell everybody, don't come into contact with a woman for like 3 days or something. don't come into contact with women, so that you don't become impure and then get killed for approaching a holy spot while spiritually unclean. So this is a very big part of that, right? We see how that manifests in basic bodily functions, but because it involves blood, and I'm sure that's a very large part of it, right? We know blood is something that is, it's not necessarily clean in general. So in this case as well, the menstrual cycle is a part of that designation about how things are treated, but it is considered a discharge from the body, but it is a very specific kind, just like the first part here about what men can have that's of a specific kind. And so either case, you're going to be separated from others, and don't come into contact with anything that person has touched or had any kind of discharge around. It's not the most clean of portions, but it does get straight to the point about what is and is not clean in these very specific contexts. So another note for women, there is a 7-day period in which it's expected to last. So during those 7 days is when she's supposed to separate herself. But let's say outside of those 7 days, right? So day 1, she leaves, day 7 comes around, and it's still not done. Well, she still is expected to be separated, and it's considered almost think of it like bonus days, right? So it lasts even longer. So with that being considered, she has a whole process for that too. In any case, we now know what must be done to avoid becoming unclean, lest you have to remain unclean until evening. 7th portion, chapter 15, verse 29. And on the 8th day she shall take for herself 2 turtle doves or 2 young doves, and bring them to the Kohen, to the entrance of the tent of meeting. And the Kohen shall make one into a sin offering, and one into a burnt offering. And the Kohen shall effect atonement for her before the Lord from the uncleanness of her discharge. And you shall separate the children of Israel from their uncleanness, so that they will not die on account of their uncleanness, if they defile my sanctuary which is in their midst. This is the law for one who has a discharge, and one from whom semen issues, through which he becomes unclean, and for a woman who has her menstrual flow, and for one who has a discharge, whether male or female, and a man who cohabits with an unclean woman. So now we get to the conclusion of all of this, right? So how she can be cleansed. The 8th day she takes the 2 turtle doves, it brings them to the Kohen, and so on. And the usual process, right? One's a sin offering, one is a burnt offering, and she will be cleansed. And then this last 3-verse set here, you shall separate the children of Israel from their uncleanness, so that they will not die on account of their uncleanness, if they defile my sanctuary, which is in their midst. And it's very clear, these are the laws for the men and women who have these experiences. And just what I was talking about before with Moses warning them about interacting with their spouses and so on. Right? The reason for this is because by being in a very holy place while not clean, you can invoke the fury of God that will unfortunately kill you. So that is why it's so very, very meticulous, and it's so specific about all of this, because unclean and spiritually unclean people approaching a holy thing can cause great afflictions, and they themselves can be killed for it. With that is the end of Parashat Metzora. Thanks for listening. If you learned something new, well, now you know. It was definitely, especially the end there, certainly not the subject you'd expect to be learning about outside of a health class, right? But it turns out this is all very important. And I think also, we talk about the spiritual purity, but we also can consider this broadly speaking. I mentioned before discharge from a person being sick, right? Or even if he spits on somebody, then that person becomes unclean. So, that continues across the board. All forms of physical discharge from the body can cause sickness, especially if that person is carrying a disease or an illness. So it's very, very important to immediately go about getting cleansing all the things that came into contact with it, and really just being cautious about not just the physical properties, but the spiritual properties of an item and a person, which can make all the difference when you're interacting with the Most High. Until next time, this has been Shmuel Moshe with the Weekly Parashahcast. Thank you for listening, and I hope you'll tune in again. Until then, take care. Baruch Hashem.